All right. We will go ahead and begin the much coveted final panel of the conference. So Steen is going to start us off. 20 minutes as per our usual protocols, 20 minutes discussion. Lulu will be doing the discussion. Vic Khan is our second presenter, but will be coming over Zoom from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Steen, take it away.
Thank you. Showtime.
Yeah. We've got five solid minutes on stewed cabbage.
Okay, very nice. Okay, so let's try to wake up. I'm going to talk about foundation ownership and firm performance. So foundation ownership is a simple concept. There's a foundation. It's a charitable entity. It's a non-profit entity, and it kind of owns a controlling ownership share in a for-profit company, a normal company. In this case, we'll look at listed companies, and so I would not require that the foundation has majority control, but we go down to something like 20%. And the foundation has a board of its own, and the company has a board of its own. And the question is, how does this non-profit ownership affect what's going on in the company? Because these guys, in most cases, do not really have a profit incentive, right? This is an issue, right? We'll get back to some theoretical concerns here. So what the foundation, the goals which you typically find in what we call an enterprise foundation, very often there will be an enterprise goal. So the founder was, you could think about Bill Gates, maybe if it had been a Dane, what he would have done, he wouldn't have created a charitable foundation, he would have created an enterprise foundation, and the foundation would have continued to own stock in Microsoft. And he would have written into the charter, the foundation must always maintain good ownership of Microsoft, something like that. This is the structure. It actually happened with the Ford Foundation. It was what we call an enterprise foundation, but for various regulatory reasons, they didn't work out. But the intention was clearly an enterprise foundation. In aside to the company goal, there's also normal philanthropic goals, and in some cases, which we talk about also, that you can support a founding family from the revenues. Okay, so this is the basic structure, and some interesting companies around the world that A.P. Møller-Mærsk is, I think, the biggest, at least container shipping company in the world still. Armani, you know them, Bertelsmann, the big media company, Robert Bosch, all the appliances. CaixaBank is the biggest retail bank in Spain. Carl Zeiss, the optics, Carlsberg, you've drunk it. The Guardian from here. Hershey, bad chocolate, but good performance. Except if you're from Indiana, you think it's really good chocolate. Anyway, into IKEA, they actually control the IKEA stores and the whole IKEA empire. They're the franchisor of the IKEA empire, and also foundation-owned. Investor AB is the holding company of the Wallenberg family, if you will, and it's actually owned by a charitable foundation. So they used to control half of Sweden. Now it's down to 20%. So Cowley, when we talk about them, big Kuehne & Nagel, I think one of the biggest distribution companies in the world. Lloyd's Register from here, it's another UK company. Mahle, small German company, only 100,000 employees. So if you pick them up, they do things for the auto industry. Novo Nordisk, top 10 pharma company. Pierre Fabre, also top company in France, pharma. Rolex, Tata Sons. Tata is another business group, quite big in India, right? Maybe the most admired Indian company. Some say the only non-corrupt Indian company. But they have about 27 listed companies, and then they have the small fry, all the private companies, so it's a really big empire. Anyway, so some interesting companies have this ownership structure. If you want to do statistics about it, we can say that most of them are from Europe, 3/4 of enterprise foundations around the world. In this study that I'm going to talk about, we simply collected from various sources listed foundation-owned companies around the world. And as it turned out, that most are from Europe, 3/4 of them are in Europe, and 1/3 are in the Nordic area, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, so on. Okay, but you find them around the world. You find them in Bosnia, or you find them in Poland, or in Pakistan, or Turkey, whatever. There are lots of them around the world, but only in very small numbers usually. But in Denmark, you find among there are not that many listed Danish companies, maybe 200 on a good day, right? So this is a fair amount. And if you do the share of the market cap, the largest, the second largest, and the third largest Danish company is foundation owned, right? Carlsberg, A.P. Møller, Mærsk, and Novo Nordisk. These things matter in Denmark, and that's why, of course, I'm a Dane. I'm interested in this. Okay, on a good day, it's a niche phenomenon globally, right? 1% of global market value on a good day, including everything. Okay, so about theories, there are a number of reasons in agency theory why this shouldn't work. Non-profits, you don't have the profit incentive, back to Adam Smith and so on, it shouldn't work. You cannot diversify because the foundation would like to maintain control, so it's afraid of diluting its ownership shares, so you don't get risk diversification, and you don't get the market for corporate control. So you could say that all else equal, the hypothesis must be that these things will not fly. And then, to make a long story very short, it appears that they fly reasonably well, just like the bumblebee, which is supposed not to be able to fly. The engineers have calculated that the wings are too small. But the thing is that they do fly, right? And so what about the second order effect? There must be something, which kind of makes them tick. And so Henry Hansman is not here any longer, but he actually formulated the first efficiency rationale for non-profit enterprises, basically saying under some circumstances it can be beneficial not to have a for-profit structure if your customers are afraid that they will get exploited by the for-profits provider of hospital services, for example. So that's why this was his view, why you find many non-profit hospitals. Colin has talked about trust, foundation ownership and trust. I've talked about ownership commitment. The British Academy have stressed this purposeful stuff. Some people have talked about employees, millennials, motivated by the higher purpose and so on. So it may be that they would rather want to work for a foundation-owned company. And there's also some work about the governance structure, which I did with Henry. Okay. So before we start, you should know that there are two kinds of enterprise foundations. One is kind of the charitable foundation, predominantly charitable, like the Carlsberg Foundation. So they own a beer company and they use the revenues or the dividends from the beer company to distribute to science mainly. Also some art and so on. But basically, that's the structure. And then you have family foundations like the Anheuser-Busch Foundation, which is really all about protecting the legacy and the wealth of a couple of families actually now. After the merger, it's not just one family, but it's more. So So basically, this is, I think, very close to family business. This is kind of more difficult to understand from an economic viewpoint. But family business, basically, all these problems with agency are somewhat less pronounced in family foundations. Okay, so data that we have all listed foundation-owned companies around the world, and we have these two groups. We select them, and we select for each foundation-owned company, we select a control which is family-owned and another control which is investor-owned. So I think both are interesting comparisons. And so this would leave us, after all is said and done, with about 106 foundation-owned firms and an equivalent number of family firms and investor-owned firms. And, observations over 20 years, so this gives us a fairly big sample in terms of firm year observations. So, and I'm going to talk about performance and in different ways. First, kind of standard finance, return on assets, firm value, shareholder returns, sales growth, and then also about ESG ratings, sustainability, how do they perform, And then I'm going to use acquisition performance as a kind of test, of what does the market say. It's kind of difficult to do instrumental variables or diff and diff on these things because the whole idea of having foundation ownership is that they don't change their ownership because they want to maintain their ownership, right? But we've kind of tried to use acquisition performance. So when a foundation-owned company acquires another company, what does the market say? What are the abnormal returns to acquisition? Those are this is the agenda now. So we start with financial performance and looking at, let's say, a return on assets here. I bundled two control groups here. So we have the black one is kind of foundation-owned companies, and the gray one is non-foundation-owned companies in the same industry and size group, right? So selected to match in that sense. And it looks okay. And if we test it using pairwise t-test and so on, it also looks okay. So basically, they overperform in terms of return on assets, in terms of fair value. It's less clear, but they also in this case overperform with regard to stock returns. Growth, they don't overperform. Actually, there is some earlier findings that we have that they actually underperform with regard to growth. And it's easy to understand why, because basically they don't like diluting their ownership. So the real growth event is the acquisition. Right? That's where your sales grow by 50% or 100%, and they don't really take part in that. But if you look at only small growth, rates like from 0 to 10 and so on, it looks like basically like, much like what the others do. But they don't have the really large growth events. Okay. And we can then, of course, try to put in a number of control variables, like firm, we do control for firm size and selection, but we can try to check whether, we control perfectly. We also can control for leverage, investment, R&D, firm age, and so on. And when we put enough control variables in, we get insignificance. I should say, however, that when we talk about this, it's known that many of these are endogenous from previous research. Like we know that these foundation-owned companies, they tend to have higher R&D ratio, or they also tend to be older. So when we control for firm age, it could be that we're over-controlling some of these things, or leverage. Generally speaking, they don't like leverage too much because the goal is in some sense, to maximize the survival of the company. They care so deeply about the company. So basically, they have higher equity to assets ratio, for example, lower leverage ratios. But when we control for everything, we'll get insignificance, more or less. Okay, so what about the second idea, charitable versus private foundations? When we just look at return on assets, firm value, stock returns, and growth, and so on, we don't see any effect here. So it's not as if the charitable foundations underperform the family foundations. Robustness checks, we do a number of different things, some bad instrumental regressions. We type different types of, how do we rationalize foundation ownership. I'll show you in a minute what we do with the acquisition performance, and we try to do two-step models and so on. But we do have a problem with identification. No question that we have that. So the best, I think, maybe the best kind of attempt that we have here at solving this is, what does the market say? So we do a standard event study methodology where we look at acquisitions by foundation-owned companies, and we have in different event windows, which I'll show you in a minute. And then we calculate the abnormal returns, to these acquisitions, standard finance. And so basically that's what we do. And when we do that and distinguish between the two types, foundation-owned companies in general, and then have charitable companies, those which are owned by charitable foundation in particular, what we see a pattern is that, there's no kind of effect. It's not as if, foundation ownership as such influences, there are specific abnormal returns to acquisitions by foundation-owned companies here. But what we do see, if we split between charitable and family businesses, we do see underperformance here with regard to in these charitable foundations. I would say here, in this sample of 106, we have 20 family foundations and about 80 kind of non-family or charitable foundations. So the majority here are kind of charitable, as we call them. So third step is sustainability or ESG ratings. I don't care too much for ESG ratings. I think they're horrible and so on, but what can we do, right? So just draw the curves here. Here we have the foundation-owned firms, the black one. Then we have some investor-owned firms, and then we have the family-owned firms, and it looks okay, right? And when we do, over to controlled regressions and so on, it still looks okay, except for the governance kind of. There is some, and governance. I think it's not too difficult to understand because you have many of these foundation-owned companies have dual-class shares, for example, in order to exercise ownership with a minimum equity capital, or they also have issues with regard to who should sit on the board. Maybe they like to be represented on the board, and so on. I'm done almost, and so on. So anyway, but with regard to general ESG, environmental and social, they actually do quite good. We can also do this in terms of other sustainability measures, like we do employee satisfaction. There is one problem with ESG is that these take everything and put it into one basket. So if we just look at, let's say, carbon dioxide emissions or work injuries and so on, I think these must probably be better measures of, so that's why we try to look at some more specific measures here. And in general, it just looks nice. Foundation ownership is associated with with more employee satisfaction, less carbon dioxide emissions, more recycling, and less work lost time injury rates, work accident rates, and so on. So the sustainability measures look good, and if we again distinguish between charitable and family foundations, we find that there's no significance, except that the charitable foundations here are a bit better in terms of environmental ESG ratings. Okay, so conclusion. They have broadly similar financial performance. We have lower acquisition performance in those owned by charitable foundations, and generally speaking, good ESG performance, particularly compared to family-owned firms. I think, basically, what can we learn from this? A number of things. I think basically there are a number of countries in the world which don't really allow these entities. The US was a case not too long ago, but no longer, right? So we have the Lex Paul Newman, with Paul Newman's foundation-owned company was allowed as part of a tax reform under the Trump administration. So basically, so now they're allowed, and you also see in the US, you see various approximations to foundation ownership. We have something we call what's called perpetual purpose trusts, which kind of simulate a bit of the same flavor as foundation-owned companies. So we do find it, but it's almost non-existent still. You might be able to make a claim that these are, very long run. They really want to keep their stock until expiry, you could say. Like you used to say, we used to keep the bonds until they expired. In the same way, they want to keep the stock until they expire. So basically, and of course, we find other types of long-term ownership structures, like family business co-ops and sometimes state-owned enterprises, like, for example, Singapore and Temasek, basically having the same idea. Yeah, I'm almost done. And some would say that there is this is kind of an out of sample test of purposeful companies. So that's it.
All right.
I did it.
2 minutes to spare. You didn't even get into boiled caviar. All right, Lulu, 20 minutes for you as well, and
Yes.
you can start whenever you want.
Thanks. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks. I'm thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's after 2 years. I'm really happy to see Elaine and everybody else, right? So yes, I'm Lulu Lan. I'm from the National University of Singapore, and I'm actually from the business school and the law school. But I'm actually more of a lawyer by training, and of course, from my commentaries, you can see the difference, when you're a lawyer, you're commenting on a business paper, the angle is slightly different. Okay, anyway, of course, every time I come, this is the 6th time I'm here with GCGC, and of course, every time I feel grateful, and I always ask Elaine, is there anything I can do, for the organization? she says, yeah, you can comment on paper. And I said, okay. And she says, oh, why don't you take Steen's paper? And I said, yeah, I know Steen. His paper must be good. It's okay, I'll take it. But actually, in the end, I realized it's actually a 98-page. It's a big bundle. It's a big bundle. When I started reading, I said, I printed it out. I actually printed because it was just too long to read it online. And I realized that it's actually 2 papers. All right, 2 papers, and I was telling myself, I think I've really paid my lunch. Right, I really paid my lunch. 2 papers. Okay, the first paper is actually on foundation ownership and sustainability, international evidence. And the second paper is actually on foundation ownership and financial performance. So it's actually 2 papers. And of course, there are some things which I wanted to ask Steen and maybe to clarify. So the 2 papers are well related and presumably based on the same sets of companies, because, okay, that's good. Because that's one thing I wanted to ask Steen, there isn't a list of the companies. And then if you look at the years that they are being examined, it's actually different, So, and the numbers of companies that's actually in the data set is actually different as well. So, for lawyers, we are a bit OCD when it comes to these kind of things. I get panic, oh, are they the same set of data? So I assume that they are the same set of data. All right, so paper 1 compares empirically the ESG performance of foundation-owned companies with that of listed families and investor-owned companies, while paper 2 compares, again, listed companies. So whether is it foundation-owned companies, or whether is it family-owned companies, the whole data sets are supposed to be listed companies. All right. So, of course, like what Steen says, with the 2 papers, the authors found that foundation-owned firms, which are FOFs, exhibit higher ESG performance, especially on the social aspect, than matched family firms, and do no worse than matched investor-owned firms. Right? And in terms of financial performance, FOFs perform as well as matched family firms and investor-owned firms. All right, I think that's as far as I can handle the stats. All right, so the conclusion is actually insightful because it shows that foundation ownership may be a good corporate form to promote long-term sustainability. We talk a lot about, sustainability. So I think this is a good corporate form and for corporate social responsibility without sacrificing financial performance, from what Steen has said. And the other good points about this is that it is supposedly international in nature because they studied 28 countries. But if you look at the data set, it's actually quite small, right? If you actually look at the data set, it's actually quite small. So the first paper used 178 public listed firms. Only 57 of them are actually foundation-owned firms. All right, out of the 57, only 40, if I remember, I think it's 46 of them are actually charitable foundations. 11 of them are actually family firms. All right, so it's actually quite a small sample size. And if you look across 28 countries, I think probably just on average, it's only one or 2. From the country. So it's quite a small sample, but understandably, again, foundation, this kind of organizational structure, it's found generally in the civil law jurisdiction. All right, from the common law, like Asia, like England, like Canada, like Australia, you don't really find foundation firms because it's just not in our legal system. All right, so that's the discrepancy, between why the data set is actually so small. All right, of course, if you look at the stats, the results are, the p-value looks strong, especially for paper 1. When you look at the individual ESG components, the positive effect of foundation ownership is mainly driven by the social dimension. All right, so which means that, I think that's like what Elizabeth says. When you try to put them together, they sort of cancel each other. But if you examine the individual ESG component, S actually stands out for foundation families. All right, for foundations-owned enterprise. The governance part is actually low, right? Because if you think about, the point that They don't really change board of directors. They're self-appointed. They hold majority shares. They don't sell out. Things like that. Actually, from a corporate governance point of view, it's not supposed to be good. So it does cancel out effect on that sense. All right. So some of the comments, of course, because I was reading 2 papers, right? So and again, we are so OCD about definitions. The paper 1, when they sort of, the data set, when they selected, it was actually, they defined ownership as 10% of voting rights. Paper 2 defines it at 20%. So of course, for me, I get a little bit upset. It's like 10%, 20%, so what is it? So at least I think Steen clarifies it's supposed to be 20%. I guess at the end of the day, it's a bit strange because with 10%, the data set is actually smaller. I thought with 10%, the data set should be bigger, right? That's intuitively, isn't it? If you sort of lower down the ownership, you should be able to find bigger set of data set. But the contrast is true, the reverse is true. With 20%, it's actually, they have a bigger data set. So I'm not sure how they did it. Maybe Steen can, explain a little bit, And so having a more consistent definition, I think, would be good. And, from a law point of view, I think 10% or 20% doesn't really make a big difference. I think statistically it does. But I think from a legal point of view, we want to look at control. We want to look at control. Is the company actually controlling the enterprise? I think at the end of the day, that's the question for us, right? So it doesn't really matter whether 10%, 20%. If you look at Carlsberg, it's actually 51%. All right? So I think maybe you can actually, but I think maybe you can define control as defined under the law, because it's across, defined under the law as controlling that company where they can make decisions. Okay, they can actually make decisions in terms of appointment of directors, in terms of the major decision as a controlling shareholder. All right, so I'm just thinking a little bit, especially when it comes to definitions. All right, the other comment that I have is that if you look at the paper, the distinction between family foundations or private foundations and charitable foundations isn't very clear. All right, the definition isn't very clear. As I think a lot of families that I understand, they actually set up foundations with charitable cause as one of the purpose. If you want a foundation, even for private companies, even for private foundations, I think they do have some charitable objectives. All right, because I was talking to a student from Austria, he was telling me that, okay, the family company actually has, they hold shares in the family company through foundations, but it's just a small charitable part. The rest of it is actually for the family. So my question is, how would you define whether this is a charitable foundation? Because I think even for family foundations, they do have some charitable reason, just for tax purpose, right? So, so maybe distinction can be made on the percentage of income being put, or the definition by the law as to charity. I was looking at Taiwan law, right? Taiwan law, and they would define charitable foundation as 60%. You have to put at least 60% of your income into charitable causes. Okay, the rest you can keep it for the family. So I'm not sure whether it is the same throughout all countries, but there is this threshold for you to qualify as foundation. For charitable foundation. So that's something maybe you want to think a little bit. Okay, so again, if you look at, so I tried to look at Carlsberg, right? So to understand a little bit more about charitable foundations, I look at Carlsberg. Apparently, Carlsberg doesn't really tell you how much of the income they put into their charitable objectives. It's declared every year by the directors. And because the foundation itself, it's not a public listed company. It's actually a private foundation, all right? So their accounts are actually not open. You can see the charter, but you can't see the accounts, all right? So it's actually up to the directors of Carlsberg to declare how much they are going to use it for the charitable cause. So that's one thing. And out of the charitable cause, if you look at it, they put 8%, okay, there are 4 objectives under Carlsberg Foundation. So 8% is actually put in the research of the beer. That's Carlsberg Research Laboratory. Then the other one is actually given to the museum. All right. 13% is actually given to this Terborg Foundation. I think it's an arts foundation. Something to do with paintings and all that kind of thing. But the rest of it, which means the bulk of it, goes to Department B, right? If you look at it, the bulk of it goes to Department B. And if you look at the definition of department, for lawyers, we look at definitions, right? So for Department B, what do? The objectives is actually to promote and support the natural sciences, as well as mathematics and philosophy, the humanities and social science. That's it. All right, so you can be anything. Even if you give it to the family, it's to promote harmony within the family. So that's social science part. So the bulk of it, I'm not saying that how Carlsberg does it. I'm sure that it's actually good. But if you look at the charter of some of these foundations, it's actually quite wide. All right, and we don't really know what they do with the money. Okay, so that's something when I try to understand a little bit more about foundations. All right, so again, continuing with the distinctions between family foundations and charitable foundations, and of course, the paper talks about charitable foundations structure actually allows responsible business behavior. But then I think that's not really true, because I think even in the study they did find differences depending whether it qualifies as a charitable foundation or family foundation. All right, for family foundation, they do find evidence where they try to reserve money for the family rather than putting it back to the company, things like that. So there is agency cost for family foundations. All right, so it's not entirely true that they are strictly responsible business behaviors. So I have an example. I use this example, Taiwan Chung Kung Hospital. Okay, Taiwan Chung Kung Hospital, if you understand a little bit, it's actually a hospital being held by one of the wealthiest family in Taiwan. All right, it's actually Wang Yongqing. He's the plastic king. So he's a billionaire. He's a billionaire in Taiwan. So what he did was that this was a vehicle for him to control his own company. All right. So the hospital is supposed to be one of the charitable cause under the family foundation. And what they do is that they actually, so the profits comes from Formosa Plastic Company, which is one of the biggest listed company in Taiwan Stock Exchange. All right. So they get a lot of money through there, and then of course part of it is supposed to give to the hospital. But who are sitting on the hospital boards is actually the family. All right, so that's one thing. All right, and they get to control actually what the hospital does as well. So this, if you actually just Google, all right, what happened was that there was a dispute between the management of the hospital, who decided that they should actually put more funds in ER, because they feel that the ER it's not a profitable department, but it's an essential department. So that's from the hospital management point of view. But from the family's point of view, they've decided that this is not the best way of using money. All right, so they actually fired the ER head of department. All right, so what I'm trying to say is that if they are truly charitable, all right, then profits wouldn't be on their mind. All right, but in this case, they were actually thinking about profits as well. So they were profit driven, even though the bulk of their money actually came from Formosa Plastic Company. All right, so what I'm trying to say is that it may not be true actually to lump all foundations as one. Because I think every foundation is actually quite different, and their purpose is actually quite different, and Carlsberg may be one of those special ones, So, okay, so I think the next point that I wanted to point out is how foundation influence companies should be explained clearer. I think they can control through the appointment of directors, right, most of the time. But I think there is actually a paper by you and Henry Hensman as well to say that the distance between the board of the foundation and the board of the enterprise, the wider the distance, it's actually better for the company. That means you give the company, the enterprise company, autonomy to run how they want to do, all right? So I mean, this kind of arguments can go both ways, right? As a responsible owner, you should actually monitor your management, right? But on the other hand, I think papers from Steen's paper and Henry's papers said that, well, maybe the distance is actually good, all right, in the case of foundation. All right, so these are some of the things. And let's see, all right, okay, 3 more minutes, all right. Okay, so again, yes, the foundations may have some charitable goals, but I think if you look at, I use Carlsberg as an example, the goals are actually framed very widely, all right? It's not, and some of them may not be very congruent with the company, with those of the company. So, I've actually written here. And I think to say that, it is not true to say that foundation-owned firms are held accountable to the foundation and for the profit. Foundation-owned firms are held accountable to their non-selfish purpose stipulated in their charter. I think that's not true, because the charter of the foundation belongs to the foundation. Okay, the enterprise has its own charter, okay, or has its own constitution. So unless the purpose is congruent, okay, you can't say that the enterprise should actually follow the foundation's charter just by proxy, or So I think we have to be quite clear on that. Unless the purpose are actually congruent or the same. So I actually gave an example. If you look at the for-profit Carlsberg's purpose, all right, it's to develop the art of beer making to the greatest possible degree of perfection. So that's very vague. That's the purpose. That's a corporate purpose. Okay, if you compare that to Heineken is supposed to be a family-held company, and it's one of the contrasting, data in this set. So Heineken says that we brew the joy of true togetherness to inspire a better world. So what's that? So what I'm trying to say is that it can be very wide. You can be anything. Everybody's happy, and that's it, right? So I don't know. Yeah. So anyway, again, because I didn't have the list, I could just look at the footnotes and try to actually construct how they did their matching, right? So I look at the matching things, right? So they matched, okay, Merck. So Merck was matched with Hapag-Lloyd, all right? So I actually Googled and how big they are and all that kind of thing. So there were actually a bigger one. So I was wondering, why didn't you match it with a bigger one? And then they tried to match it with another. Okay, for family, they matched it with Hapag-Lloyd, and for institutional investor, they matched it with Nippon Susan Kasha, which is investor-owned. But if you look at, I actually Googled, I tried to see what kind of companies they are. I know what Merck does. It's actually a shipping company. It's actually logistics, right? If you look at the Japanese company, it's fishing. It's actually a fishing company. So I'm just wondering, how you do this kind of matching. At least I think the industry should be the same, right? Okay, they both touches the sea, right? But I think fishing company and a logistics company, a shipping company is actually quite different, right? So I'm not sure how you choose, the companies when you do the matching. So I mean that's only one of the examples that I could see, right? So anyway, okay, finally, this is my final part. All right. So I think it's still very good. I really enjoy, even though it's like 98 pages, I really enjoy reading it, trying to see what I can learn from the papers. And so I think the two papers still give insight to really a very interesting organizational form. I think it's very interesting. But of course, there are limitations because, again, it's predominantly used in civil law countries. So again, of course, I was trying to think from a common law country, what do we have? We have trust company. Okay, that's quite similar, So maybe we can do a little bit of testing with trust company and see whether we find similar results, So trust company, it's similar. Trust is not the same. Trust, because it's not a separate legal entity. But when you put trust into a company, it is a separate legal entity, just like foundations. All right. So you can try to find a matching sample in the common law countries. And secondly, I think if you look at foundation, the original purpose of foundation is usually created to preserve the founder's legacy, family wealth, more from that point of view. I mean, Carlsberg, some of the big names, there are more outliers, special ones, rather than the common ones. The common ones, generally, you set up foundations to preserve your family wealth, to make sure that it passes down through generation. That's what we understand. So this is a little bit of something that we need to explore a little bit more. So finally, I think which element of the enterprise foundation actually drives the results? I'm interested in that, right? Is it the structure or is it the purpose? All right. If it is a structure, can we do something to a normal company? Can we mandate certain laws to make changes to a corporate structure such that it mimics, the foundation, the foundation mode, kind of thing. So these are some of the things that that when I read the paper, I sort of, thought about it, and I think I'll try to do a little bit more, and especially on trust companies, do comparative. All right, thank you so much. Thank you. Yes.
All right, Steen, do you want to defend your honor before getting more questions?
Yeah,
Okay.
I do, I will. So basically, thank you very much for this thorough reading of the paper. So basically about the number of observations, what we have, of course, is when we measure sustainability, we use ESG ratings. When did they start, right? They started to occur, basically in 2010 or something like that. So that's why we have about half the number of observations in the sustainability paper. And also for some companies, we couldn't find them. So the reason why we have variations in the number of observations is missing values of different variables. It's pretty standard in an unbalanced or in an unbalanced panel. Then about the definition, yes, it's true that we have different definitions here. In the finance paper we used 20% cutoff ratio, and in the other one we went a bit further down. I think what we did in the paper, we actually distinguished between family-owned kind of or family-related foundations and charitable foundations. And the idea here was that, the predominant, what is predominantly the objective, and so this is similar to what you say, but in most cases it's a dichotomy, right? If you like the Carlsberg that you mentioned, there hasn't been a founding family in Carlsberg for 100 years, And so actually the board of the Carlsberg Foundation is elected by the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences. They're all professors, And so basically these guys have been sitting in, they've been owning a beer company for 100 years, something like that. And, have actually been, a top 3 company in the world, right? So they haven't been doing so badly. The Carlsberg Research Laboratory don't actually do research in beer. They do research in fermentation and stuff like that, related, stuff like that. So about common law and civil law, I think that's an interesting viewpoint. But the thing is that the reason why we don't have more foundation-owned companies in the US is a specific law, which was enacted in 1969, where actually they used to be quite common in the US up to that point. So we had an Eli Lilly Foundation, a Ford Foundation, and so on. They were pretty similar to what we have in Denmark. So it's not really a question of common law or civil law. This could have been the case, and as we see now with the Newman's own kind of company, you can have similar structures in common law countries also. And India, perhaps, as a common law country, is a good example. The Tata companies in India, right? So I don't think the common law, civil law is. There is a thing in common law countries which is the aversion against perpetuities, right? You don't like perpetuities much because the idea is that contracts must be among the living, so to say. So you don't like future or past generations to bind the future generations. But as I've seen, it actually can be done and is the case. So it's not as if it's a forcing constraint here. So about the sample here, of course, you'll find the things, where you say, okay, this is not reasonable and so on. But the thing is, we have to also be a little bit careful that we don't go in, and try to kind of cherry pick here, So what we do is we try to use what is called nearest neighbor approximation. So within the industry, what is the closest company that we could find in terms of assets to the reference company? That's what we did. This was our viewpoint. Yeah.
All right, we've got a queue. Before we do that, in case Carlsberg is looking for any more professors, I just thought I'd give you my card. Let's start with Tom.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steen. Really interesting paper. And you sort of highlight at the end that you think that laws that sort of prejudice against foundations should perhaps be relaxed so that they become more of an option. And indeed, people who kind of don't really like shareholders might seize on this and saying, well, actually, we should make everything a foundation and then the world will be much better. I know this is a really difficult question, but if you got any sense about the sort of proportion of businesses based on what you've looked at, the characteristics of successful foundations, is this a solution that could be optimal for 10% of companies, 50%, or could it even be, this should be the new paradigm and most companies should be run this way?
My own take is that it would be a nightmare to mandate, or to even to subsidize industrial or enterprise foundations, But I think what I'm against is that you actually have, specific rules directed against them. It's not that bad, right? I think it kind of makes sense, for some type of companies. You can have a situation where the founder doesn't have kids or doesn't. The Carlsberg case was that the founder thought his kid was stupid, right? So that's a long story about that, So basically he thought better, when he had already created the foundation for scientific purposes, and then he said, so why don't we let them run it, better than the kid, right? So actually it can be a kind of first best in for family companies. You do have a bunch of professionals sitting on the foundations and so on. In Carlsberg it's professors, so that's abnormal, but you could also say, well, we want some businessmen to sit there and run it, and then maybe the family gets a little on the side or something like that, But anyway, we secure the company through the foundation structure.
Sorry.
Similar question or reaction. You compared it to a bumblebee, and I'm not quite sure why. I would have actually, based on theory, I would have thought it's better than the usual widely held company. As you know, Adam Smith didn't think that could work at all. And we spent all of our time thinking about how to make this widely held company possibly work, because everybody is disinterested, blah, blah, blah. Usually we talk about the one solution, controlling shareholders, because they have a concentrated interest, but they steal from the minority. That's bad. The foundation has a concentrated interest and doesn't steal. So, up to now, I think foundation ahead. Now the only possible difficulty is that the foundation has internal governance issues. Who runs the foundation? Sure, right? But not worse than the previous things that I've mentioned. The only thing that really speaks against it, I think, is if they have a strong interest in just preserving the enterprise. They're extremely risk averse, so presumably this wouldn't really work well in an industry that is highly dynamic, where you have to take very big risks. But I just was puzzled by you saying that this was such a weird thing and we wouldn't expect to observe this. And so then I should add one more thing to this. I had a discussion yesterday with your co-author about this. If we say, is this good or bad? Well, good or bad relative to what? Personally, relative to one really rich person owning all this stuff, I prefer the foundation. Same thing with the family. Widely held, well, I guess it depends who the owners are and how we have set up the governance system. It's not clear to me what I would prefer, but on a priori grounds, it looks pretty good, and I'm sort of happy that you find that it works in the real world as I would have expected.
Steen, let's harvest one more question.
Sure.
Jeff Gordon.
Right. So the U.S. Sort of experience here. Right. There was a change in the law, but for some reasons there seem to be some legacy firms. Hershey is the sort of the example that's cited in the United States, and it's a terrible example. The Hershey Trust runs Hershey's, which makes confection, and also an orphanage and school and all that, and they have neither succeed. They've obviously survived making Hershey bars, but they haven't delivered much in the sense of very little benefits for the purported beneficiary, of the trust, and it's regarded as basically having squandered a large amount of money, and it's not altogether clear why, but it's sort of like, you see Rob Sitkoff and others putting it up as an example of basically a failed organizational form. Why isn't dual-class common stock in the United States the modern alternative to the family foundation? That is to say, and if maybe to pick up the Hoger point, we've figured out a way to do it that's not a trust that doesn't use that device, but basically a dual-class common structure without a sunset, and that doesn't convert to limited voting common stock upon inheritance, that will achieve the same result. And so maybe we've already got a U.S. version of it on the way, and then the issue would be maybe that is a better form. I mean, Google hasn't done too bad, nor and Facebook is a complicated story. But the point being, maybe we've just figured out a different way to do it in the United States than has been done, and maybe that will be the direction of the way things change.
Steen, we have less than 5 minutes and
Okay.
3 other people waiting. Do you want to get the questions first? Have final word?
Yeah, sure,
Okay,
please do.
so Ron Gilson. Oh, other Ron.
I've followed.
Okay, you're good. You're good.
I've followed Steen's work and Steen's work with Henry on the structure of these organizations for at least 15 years, because I've been involved in a company like this for 15 years. It's oddly enough, it's a mutual fund. It's a 40 Act mutual fund family. At the moment, depending on which week it is, it's probably worth about $250 billion. It was originally founded in Kansas City by a couple, both of whom had cancer, both of whom were cured from cancer, and he basically took roughly $4 billion and put it into a cancer research foundation in Kansas City. They've done extremely good work. But part of what has puzzled me all this time is where are the incentives? The family's children may have been of the sort that Steen referred to before. It also went through the process of changing of management, shifting from a family operation to professional operation, and they've brought in a minority shareholder from time to time. It's been sold, but these are not small people. J.P. Morgan Chase. Nomura now owns about 40% of it, but not 40% of the vote. The foundation, the Charitable Foundation, still controls the whole thing. And I'm trying to figure out where the incentive structure comes from. The short answer, and because other people need to talk, is that it's in the 40 Act area. It is an intensely incentivized, particularly for attracting talented, intelligent management, and it. And the result has been that it's absolutely transparent, because you can track every day how much, what assets, what's been the movements under assets under management. The employee incentive, how much people get paid, portfolio managers, the CEO running, what sounds to me like a large operation, but not compared to other people in this industry, they do awfully well. And the only explanation I've come up with, and it's an N of 1, and it's limited to my assessment, but you have extraordinarily powerful incentives on the level of the talent, who, if they're not incentivized, they will leave. And it seems to work reasonably well. And the foundation does really, really first-rate high-end cancer research. But the only explanation I can come up with has been the peculiarity of the industry, the transparency of the industry, and the stunning high incentives on the part of the talent. They can walk out of Kansas City and move to New York pretty much anytime they want. But there was some crazy tax work to do to get this thing to work, but it works. And the only explanation I can come up with is the characteristics that I described.
I'm trying to get Ron and Tobias's questions in, and then you can have last words.
Okay.
Quickly, though. Yeah, sorry.
I'm usually quick. I think one issue is exactly how much control does the foundation have in the underlying enterprise? I think it'd be nice to be able to document, is the foundation the largest shareholder, given that you've got
it is
a different...
in every case.
I think that's a very important piece of information. And the second question, I guess, is whether the charities, in many cases, are still controlled by the family. You're saying some of them clearly aren't, but the charitable foundations, I'm still wondering if many of them are controlled, and also whether they may have minority shareholdings in the enterprise so that there's additional benefits going on. Thanks.
Mike, over to Tobias.
Just quickly building on something that Ron said. So I think a difference that we might see during the recent years is actually that it's not only for mature firms, but it's really also for growth firms. So a little bit in opposition to what Holger said, because my experience is that there are many entrepreneurial types who just hate the idea that their company, which has purpose, is sold to one of the big, for example, particularly in the tech industry, to the big techs. And therefore, for them, it's already interesting. And then the puzzling question is, how do they manage, of course, the financing constraints? But if you're not particularly interested in profits, but purpose, this may work. So I'm not saying this is for everybody, but it might work in certain circumstances.
All right. Any last words? In 14 seconds or less?
Very nice. So there is a paper by Eugene Fama and Michael Jensen about this, a couple of papers actually, where they say that they would expect them to underperform. So if you want classical finance justifications, they call them commercial non-profits, but I kind of take it as a kind of indicator. About dual class shares, I think that's certainly could be part of the solution, but it does leave the question, what happens if this family continues to control, and what happens if they can't agree, and so on. So I think in that sense the foundation is better, and I think that Zuckerberg in Facebook is actually trying to do something which is actually, if he'd been Dane, he would probably have created an enterprise foundation. About incentives, what makes it work, right? I think that the people identify with the purpose. That's what happens. So if you have a very high-minded person's purpose, it kind of attracts a certain type of people, like Ron Gilson, and they're kind of motivated by this, and don't care too much about the money. The role of the family, it varies. You find different degrees, but there are even rules about this, so the founding family in Danish enterprise foundations cannot have a majority of the board. They must be in a minority, and so on. The average fraction of family members in Danish boards, which I know is about, I think it's 10% or something like that. It's not like 100 or anything close. And it's not their money anymore, right? So that's a big thing, So if they choose, to benefit themselves in terms of related party transactions, at least if you're in Denmark, problem is, what if you're not, right? But if you're in Denmark, you will actually, chances are you will get caught and convicted for this, right? So investor protection also works at this level. Pretty much.
I think that's it. Thank you so much. Nice job.